And now live on Book TV, an author discussion on how privacy has changed in the digital age from the Annapolis Book Festival in Maryland.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Annapolis Book Festival. I'm going to ask everybody to please turn off your cell phones, mute it in some way, shape, or form so we don't disturb these fine gentlemen here. For the first 30 minutes, I'm going to be asking questions, but afterwards I'm going to ask you to line up and please ask them questions. Ideas, comments are welcome as well, so just right there in the center. My name is Bruce Schwartz, and I am the head of the Academic Technology Department here at the wonderful Key School, and I welcome you. Prior to making some introductions for these gentlemen, I just want to throw out some points that I would like you to consider, especially as they're making their comments, but then also when you want to do your questions. First, according to Symantec, which is an internet security company, in 2014, internet threat report threats increased by organized crime gangs by 23% last year. Of that, the healthcare industry was hit with 37% of the breaches. That includes Anthem. 11% was the retail market, Target, and 10% in the education sector. A friend of mine just told me the other day that Samsung TVs, their smart TVs, in their terms of service agreement has a clause that says, please be aware that if your spoken words include personal or other sensitive information, that information will be among the data captured and transmitted to a third party through your use of voice recognition. And of course, on a daily basis, we hear about NSA surveillance. So with that, what I would like to do is introduce these fine gentlemen, and for the first 30 minutes, I will be asking them questions, and then the final 15 minutes, we will invite you to come up to the microphone. Directly to my right is Marc Rotenberg. He is the President and Executive Director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C. He teaches information privacy and open government law at Georgetown University Law Center and frequently testifies before Congress on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. Mr. Rotenberg testified before the 9/11 Commission on Security and Liberty, Protecting Privacy, Preventing Terrorism, and has authored many amicus briefs for federal and state courts. Mr. Rotenberg is the co-editor of Privacy in the Modern Age. In the center is Amitai Etzioni, who is a university professor and professor of international relations at George Washington University. He served as a senior advisor at the Carter White House and taught at Columbia University, Harvard Business School, and the University of California, Berkeley. A study by Richard Posner ranked him among the top 100 intellectuals. Professor Etzioni is the author of The New Normal, Finding a Balance Between Individual Rights and the Common Good. And at the end, we have Jim Dwyer. Jim writes the About New York column in the New York Times. He has worked in newspapers for 35 years. Last year, he published with Touch Press an interactive book called False Conviction, Innocence, Guilt, and Science that uses games, videos, and multimedia tools to show how the mistakes we make in everyday life can become embedded in criminal justice system. Mr. Dwyer has written or co-authored 5 other books, including 102 Minutes, The Unforgettable Story of the Fight to Survive Inside the Twin Towers, which was a National Book Award finalist. Mr. Dwyer is the author of More Awesome Than Money, a book about 4 young men looking to help others protect their privacy from Facebook. So first, we're going to start with Jim. Jim, during a recent conversation that you and I had, you mentioned that privacy and privacy settings are an illusion. Can you talk about that a little bit? And then I think that you have something very interesting to show up on the screen.
Sure. We all know that we don't want mom to be looking at the picture of us on Facebook with the Budweiser logo printed around our navels, or any other number of crazy things that might end up in a public space like Facebook. So over the last 5 or 6 years, Facebook, prodded by some of its erstwhile competitors, has made fine-grained control part of its offerings to the users. And that says, okay, I can set up this post so it's only seen by this body of friends, or that post only goes to the people on my softball team, or what have you. But one thing that is never excluded from that, whatever you put up there, is that Facebook itself sees all. It is omniscient. And it even knows when you have had second thoughts. You've started to write something and X'd it out, thought better of it before you hit the post button. There's actually, they've done some extensive studies at Facebook about this, what they consider lost content. Most of us would consider it, perhaps prudent speech. But we are in an age of what I consider the big bang moment of the digital age, right? Things are still flying around, taking shape in ways that we have really no ability to discern yet. And privacy is one of these terrifyingly complicated parts of it. But we should all consider where the World Wide Web came from, where many of its most useful features came from. They were built by individuals. They were not built by corporations. They were the ideas of a few people who were able to use sweat equity rather than major capital equity to make important advances. Right. So that's how I ended up writing about these four young guys, four boys who were college students who decided they wanted to try and build an alternative to Facebook. They didn't succeed yet. But one of the places that has this do-it-yourself, drag yourself up by your bootstraps DNA that I think is intrinsic to understanding the age that we're in is Mozilla, which makes a browser called Firefox. And I'm going to show you a little tool that Firefox has that you can add to your browser. Okay, so if you all spin around there and look up at the screen, so there are things called add-ons that you can attach to your browser, and there's one called Lightbeam that I'm particularly fond of. So what Lightbeam does is keep an eye on who or what has attached itself to your browser without you necessarily knowing it. Okay? Now, right now, this doesn't look like a whole heck of a lot. I'm just going to, whoops, close this thing here. Whoops. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so what we're going to do here is try a couple of sites. Let's see, ESPN, okay, worldwide leader in something or other. New York Times, I've heard of that paper. Let's try C-SPAN. Let's see what happens when we put on C-SPAN. What is it, cspan.org, .com? .org, yeah. And there we are. Boy, this is very meta. And let's just go for, let's say, Citibank. Happens to be a bank I know. Okay, now we're going to go back to Lightbeam. There are the things that, all of those triangles represent third-party trackers that have attached themselves to my browser in the last 90 seconds, okay? So here's the New York Times, and around it, somehow Facebook got in there. Google is in there. I don't know what IMR Worldwide is, NewYorkTimes.com, Facebook.com, and there's C-SPAN, which is connected to typekit.net, which is connected to the Times as well, so they kind of, as you can see, are cousins by marriage. And there's C-SPAN video. Down here we have down here. Oh, that's Citibank, and what do they got on there? Google is in there, and Google. Now, Google is our friend, right? Except Google is collecting every single bit of information, every thought you have, and auctioning it off every second of the day.
So, Jim, the 16 third-party sites, those apply to the 4 sites that you have up there right now?
Correct, that's right. So up at the top, you'll see 4 sites, 16 third-party sites. Now, if we just add a few more things in there, I'm not going to do it now, put in Home Depot, put in whatever you might be interested in shopping for, you'll find within a few minutes a proliferation. Your entire screen will be in motion with this thing. Now, this is sort of meant to terrify you, but you know, only in the sense that when kids take driver's ed, they're shown videos of car crashes, right? What happens when you don't wear your seatbelt? What happens when you don't do this? This is part of what our education, our social education ought to involve, the level of tracking that is invisible to us until we turn on something like this light beam site.
So, Mark, is that terrifying?
Well, I don't think it's terrifying. I think it's actually a reflection of how we're in the very early stages of a policy discussion about the future of privacy. And that, of course, is why we decided to write a book titled Privacy in the Modern Age, The Search for Solutions. And I should say a few words about the genesis of the book, because it will help you understand, I think, the significance of the privacy issue, not only in our daily lives, as Jim has just described, the enormous frustration of people trying to understand who collects information about them, which is a very real problem, but also the big policy and legislative questions that the Congress confronts, the courts confront, diplomats between the United States and the European Union currently discuss about the flow of data. We are in the midst of one of the most significant policy debates concerning the use of technology, I would say, in a very long time. And again, just returning to the book briefly, it is partly about the beginning of an organization I founded with various colleagues and friends more than 20 years ago called the Electronic Privacy Information Center. And the book traces our history. Now, here's the remarkable part about the book, and coming back to some of Jim's points, how very familiar these issues are. What we were concerned about in 1994 was the NSA's monitoring of Internet communication. And what we were concerned about was the use of vulnerable technologies that did not provide adequate privacy for email. And what we were concerned about was a lack of security and stability in network communications. Now, this has been a very big debate, you know, since Mr. Snowden disclosed documents in June of 2013. These are the same issues we were talking about 20 years ago, and trying at that time to establish some baseline expectations for privacy in the modern age. Now, part of the book is also about the many people that we've worked with and our expert advisors who are legal scholars, technology experts, people like Ron Rivest and Whitfield Diffie, for example, who provided the building blocks for modern security standards and the development of encryption techniques that all of you rely on, by the way. When you go online and you make a purchase through Amazon and you type in your credit card number, there's a reason you can do that securely. And that's because in the early days of the online economy, certain decisions were made about ensuring that your credit card number could pass from your computer to the host computer without anyone getting access to it. At least in theory, if that works, that's a great thing because business online becomes possible. When it doesn't work, of course, there are enormous problems. And so for the last 20 years, we've also looked at the challenges to online privacy and security and pointing to the risk that the NSA created when in effect it said we don't necessarily want people to have secure online communications, because if they have secure online communications, it's possible that ability might be misused. It could be used in ways that pose risks to public safety, and I wouldn't dispute that, of course. But in a decision about technical standards for the Internet that diminishes the privacy that users might otherwise be entitled to, there is also a substantial risk and that is that the cyber attacks that we're experiencing today from foreign adversaries and criminal hackers and others result in part from the decisions that have been made to diminish the level of privacy and security that would otherwise be available. So we see this in a very big picture about how safe the internet is to use when people go online. It's also a fascinating question from a legal or regulatory perspective. There is right now between the United States and the European Union a very big debate over whether companies, internet companies based in the United States, provide adequate privacy protection for EU consumers who go to these internet companies and provide their personal information. And part of what's going on here is a contrast between two legal systems. European Union said more than 20 years ago, we want a comprehensive approach to privacy protection. Privacy is very important. Of course, we support commerce and freedom of expression, but we will establish a comprehensive approach. And any business that collects and uses personal data is going to be subject to that approach. That's the baseline in the European Union. The U.S. has taken a somewhat different approach. We had a moment, let's say about 40 years ago, where we decided to put in place a comprehensive approach for the federal government. We called that the Privacy Act, but we chose not to do it for the private sector. We sort of went sector by sector. You have privacy protection, for example, for your cable subscriber records, but not your magazine subscription records. And then as we entered the internet age, we said, well, we're not even sure that we actually need law because people can make choices. They'll have all these different options available to them. If they don't like, Google, they can use another search company. Or if they don't like Facebook, they can use another social media company, and essentially made the decision not to put in place comprehensive privacy law. And as a consequence, of course, there's very little privacy protection for internet users today for US-based services. Europeans are saying increasingly, we're not happy about that arrangement, and we think the US will need to do more. So, and finally, just to get to the third part of the book, as I said, we talk a bit about the history of the organization, our litigation strategies and advocacy strategies. We actually did the first internet petition more than 20 years ago. I'm proud of that. It was to oppose the NSA's encryption scheme. We got 50,000 people to sign up. I mean, now that's like a chat room or something, but 20 years ago it felt like half the internet. So we did the first internet petition. We brought lots of cases and open government cases and so forth. But the last part of the book tries to set out concrete recommendations, because it is very much my view that these are problems that we need to find solutions for, which is not the same thing as saying these are problems that can be solved. Anyone who's worked in the realm of environmental protection, for example, if someone walked in and said, I figured out how to solve air pollution, or I figured out how to solve water pollution, you probably wouldn't take that comment very seriously, because I don't think in our modern industrial economy we solve those problems. But I think we find ways to manage those problems. And so we've taken a similar approach with privacy protection. We've said, how do we get the advantages of the new technologies while minimizing the privacy risk? Coming back to Jim's example, I don't think internet users should spend their evenings trying to figure out who's collecting data about them, or changing their privacy settings, or restoring their opt-in, or anything like that. I think the service should simply be designed to provide a high level of privacy to the individual, and if the individual chooses to disclose information to third parties, that should be their choice. I mean, no one is ever denied the opportunity to exchange their data to others. What we're objecting to is the current default setting, which basically says that companies can take your information unless you object. Now, that seems entirely unfair. It's a bit like, an auto manufacturer saying, well, we've got safety features on this car, things like seat belts and turn indicators and stuff like that, and brake pads for your tires and so forth. They're all sitting in the trunk, and if you want to take advantage of any of them, there's an instruction manual, and you can figure out how to install that stuff, and you might find it useful. But isn't it really fun to drive a car? I mean, isn't that where we are today with the internet? Isn't it really kind of fun to use the internet? Yeah, there's some privacy stuff somewhere and some manuals and stuff, and if you have the time, good luck with it. But that's entirely upside down. I think we need to think about internet privacy and the protection of privacy, that's the default. Let's establish safeguards, leave people with the freedom and the choice to disclose their personal data as they choose.
Thank you. I'd like to turn a little bit towards surveillance. Some people talk about that there was the world changed after 9/11. And we find that many cities have put up cameras today. In Boston, for instance, the conviction of the bomber for the marathon was largely attributed to some of the images that were obtained. More cameras went up for the marathon. We hear that individuals are being tracked to and from Syria for ISIS. We also have seen, if anybody's traveled up and back on Route 95, there's a balloon type thing that is hovering over Aberdeen, I believe it is. So, Professor, if you have an opportunity here, would you please talk a little bit about, are we in a new normal?
Well, thank you, especially by closing your question by mentioning the name of a book.
My pleasure.
Very nicely you shoot it in there. So I will talk about the new normal, but I need to step back just for 1 minute so I can justify what I'm going to suggest. And my concern is, once you hear all this very concerning, somewhat alarming statement on my left and on my right, or on my right and on my left, how are we going to think about them? And my argument is that we tend to think about them like lawyers, and we should think about them like human beings. And what I mean by this is like that. We have in our courts a system which I will call extreme advocacy. It means the one side comes and says that the defendant is the most awful human being who ever existed. He pulls the hair out of cats, he tortures children. And the other side says he's a lovely kid, he gives milk to the kiddies, he takes care of his mother. And both sides, out of that clash of two extreme positions, justice is supposed to arise. And by the way, in our court system, the jury and the judge are not allowed to ask any questions. It's what the two sides bring to the table, that's it. Be applying now that to policy making. That's what's called polarization. So one side says, they violated my privacy, nothing is left, I can go to the bathroom without NSA taking my picture. And the other side says, we needed to stop terrorists which have, under every bed there's one with a nuclear weapon and such. And out of the clash of two extreme presentations like this, somehow wisdom and realistic policy is supposed to arise. I suggest instead a dialogue. We start with the assumption that we face conflicting major challenges. Life is complicated, I'm sorry. So on the one hand, we have indeed individual rights, which makes this country great, which is our greatest contribution to humanity, and they must be protected in any way we know how. On the other hand, we have public goods, security, public health, and such, which we also need to be concerned with. And it's true that some people exaggerate the threat to our security. Some people may exaggerate a little, how much little privacy we have been left. But I'm not interested in this exaggeration. I'm interested in the question that the dialogue has to start by saying we have two legitimate claims here. And not simply, let's yield to one side or the other. The next step, ladies and gentlemen, is to read the Constitution. Because keep telling us that's where the Bill of Rights comes from. But the Fourth Amendment, which is the most relevant here, doesn't say there be no search and seizure. Unlike the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law. The Fourth Amendment, on the face of it, is dialogic because it says there be no unreasonable searches, which means on the face of it there are reasonable searches in the Constitution. So those who run around and wrap themselves in the Constitution should please read one more time the Fourth Amendment. So then we come to the question, the very reasonable question, when are searches reasonable and when they are unreasonable? And we have mechanisms for that, courts and such. So now I go back And finally get to your question.
Thank you.
Surveillance. Well, surely nobody wants to be surveilled, but I think I want to surveil some other people. So, yes, we have now a situation where there are 4,000 people who went to fight with ISIS, who've been trained to commit some of the most barbaric acts of terrorism. And these 4,000 are from countries which can enter the United States without minimal screening, without visas, because they come from Britain and France. It is. I think it's reasonable to want us to know something about them once they come in the United States. I don't want to quarantine them. I don't want to jail them. I certainly don't want, by not being able to surveil them, have to send 60 FBI agents to go after them day and night. But I'd like to know, after they're back home, maybe for the first 6 months, whom they called in Pakistan, what message are they getting. You may say, no, this case is wrong. But I want to go to the profound question. Do you agree that there are sometimes situations, people come back from Ebola, they have a temperature. Is it okay for us to ask, have you been to West Africa? Is it okay for us people who came back from serving in a hospital, and surely we should cherish and appreciate them, they will stay home for 21 days so they will not spread Ebola? On all these questions, I can argue both sides. My book does exactly that. I take one by one these issues and ask, where should we tilt? But I don't accept the notion that we say a priori, my problem is violation of privacy, all the rest has to yield. And let me close by what in some way is the most challenging, I admit, my most challenging chapter, and that concerns the freedom of the press. Because we have the following interesting situation, that our newspapers decided that the editors are going to be the ultimate judges what national secrets can be kept secret and which they will publish. So a phrase which keeps coming up in the literature I read on the subject, they say the White House pleaded today with the New York Post not to publish the name of the head of the CIA station in Athens. The White House pleaded, listen, the White House pleaded with the newspaper.
Yeah, the White House pleaded not to reveal that there was torture going on, too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I know I'm tough on you. No, I'm sorry. I'm telling the truth.
Me too.
Well, that's me. I mean, no question about that. That's the whole point. There are two truths, not one.
Right.
And that's the question. How do you reconcile? Well, the newspapers decided, to give one example, during World War II, to start earlier, there are much more recent examples, that the Japanese were dropping depth charges against our submarines, but they were setting them too shallow, so they all exploded without harming our submarines. The Tribune published that information. The Japanese reset the charges, and the next week sunk 10 of our submarines. I wonder if the New York Times, or in this case the Tribune, should be the one to judge what to publish or not. I want to have a discussion of that. But let's assume for a moment you say, well, look, the editor of the New York Times and the Washington Post, these are sensible people. They will not harm the United States unduly. You know, sometimes they make a mistake when they publish, for instance, we have a mall in the headquarters of the Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or that we learned how to listen to nuclear deliberations in North Korea. Maybe they crossed the line there. But you know, as the question is, who qualifies as an editor? It turns out anybody who has a blog is an editor. That really means that we do no longer have national secrets because anything can be published.
Professor, I want to just interrupt you because we have limited time here and I want to get some additional points here. As I pointed out at the very beginning, the healthcare industry has been a victim of attacks, has had retail and so on and so forth. I want to talk a little bit about the balance between technology and human behavior. We find that today humans we are wearing Fitbits, health devices, GPS devices in our pockets. We readily swipe our credit cards. We often are asked to give our Social Security numbers for loans. Why is there, so technology enables a lot of that, but why is the human behavior such that we're not pushing back when we hear about identity theft is becoming rampant? Social Security numbers are being stolen, and fraudulent tax returns are being filed in other people's names. So,
well,
go ahead.
Let me just jump in. I mean, first of all, it's wonderful to be on a panel with Amitai. We've debated these issues, I think, since before the founding of EPIC. But also, to be clear, our book is not a strong privacy is important book. Our book is actually about emerging challenges and issues, and we're really looking at it from a variety of different perspectives, and I think you would appreciate many of those. But coming to your question, and also in our book, is the wonderful contribution of Alessandro Acquisti, who's an economist at Carnegie Mellon University, and he's specialized in a field called behavioral economics. And what Alessandro is interested in is the answer to your question. Why is it that people don't do more to protect their privacy? Why don't they spend more time checking their privacy settings or the advertisers who are following them online? And the short answer is it's not rational. It's not sensible. In other words, if you've taken some time, and this is an example involving Facebook, to set your privacy settings so that you have limited disclosure of your personal information, and many people did this, and then Facebook goes in and changes your settings, makes your information more widely available, and then says to you, but if you really care about your privacy, of course you'll go back in and change it back to your original privacy settings. We actually brought this complaint to the Federal Trade Commission. The experience of most users, I think, will understandably be, what's the point? Why are you asking me to do this if you're not going to respect my decisions? So in thinking about privacy, I think we have to move from the micro to the macro. We have to stop asking the question, why is it that people don't push back, to the question of why is it that when people try to push back, they meet such resistance? Because that turns out to be a much more interesting question and helps explain, for example, why data flows so readily from individuals to organizations, even when they're not aware of it or haven't made that explicit choice.
And Jim, is that what you have found also when you researched your book and subsequently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are legions of young hackers and builders who are trying to make better stuff. I happen to have lunch with one of them, a young man I admired a great deal, and I said, I got one of these things, these fit things, I wanted to find out like how much I was sleeping and how much I was walking, and that's, if I'm not sleeping enough and I'm not walking enough. How about that? I knew that beforehand. But he said, oh yeah, I was one of the founders of the company that built that thing. Do you know that we collect half a millennia of sleep data every night? I said, you're collecting my sleep data every night? Mm-hmm. I mean, I was pretty shocked about that. But I wondered if I could jump over to some of the things, and completely out of my depth, I have to say.
I just want to say we have about 5 more minutes until we are taking audience.
So I'll be so underwater in the next 30 seconds. Amitai was talking about these interesting divergent issues, divergent pressures, right? We want to protect ourselves from, let's say, somebody who might have been in ISIS territory and has come back from there, and who are they talking to and all that stuff. I have no problem with the government having a process for doing that stuff. But what Snowden and the other revelations of the era showed was that there was no meaningful process. The Fourth Amendment, which you says, which you rightly point out is a dialogue, right? There shall not be searches, but they shall not be unreasonable. So there has to be a determination of reasonability. Where has that happened in this age? It has dissolved. And I think, so when people seem to be screeching about privacy, they're screeching because there's no wizard who's controlling the curtain at all. And that, I think, is the real alarming piece of what has come out over the last several years to me.
It's not up to a visit, it's up to us. That's what we call democracy. So I don't want some public intellectual or professor of sociology sitting on the campus and making those decisions. That's why we write these books, to feed into a dialogue. And given more time, I would show that when we have these dialogues, rather than this polarization and screaming, very often new shared understandings do arise, and we reach a new consensus. We did it about the environment. We're doing it now about gay marriages. We did it about black and white. We did it about men and women. So we need this conversation to balance. But since I know we're about to run out of time, I just want to add one other completely different point. Going back to the question, why we are not spending more time on dealing with technology. So one half of my book, The New Normal, asks the question of what is important, what makes for a meaningful life, and what makes for a good life. And the answer we used to give to each other, though it's not polite to say it in mixed company, is affluence. And so I the other day gave a TED talk, and I start by saying, ladies and gentlemen, do you need an inflatable Santa Claus on your rooftops? And everybody chuckled. And then I said, do you need plastic pelicans on your front lawn? And people had a good little laugh. And then I said, do you need a flat TV? And I lost my audience. And I said, how about an S5 phone? And they asked me to leave. I'm exaggerating. But the point I'm trying to make, we become so enamored with the notion that the more objects we control and the more affluence we have, that's the definition of good life. It's not going to happen. We face lasting economic challenges, which will not allow us what we did in the past, give every generation a more affluent life than the last one. And even if we could, we shouldn't, because a lot of people didn't get the basics, and because it turns out that after a certain level of income, additional income really does not buy you contentment. And so the question I'm asking, the new normal, is what will make for a more meaningful life? And in the sentence, Abraham Maslow gave her the answer. Once you have your basic needs satisfied, not before. I'm not telling the poor they should enjoy their poverty. I'm saying once we're all brought up to a level where our basic needs are well stated, then to continue to treat objects as the way to express our affection, to gain prestige. That's where becomes consumerism an obsession and a form of psychological pathology. And so to get to this, we need to liberate ourselves from our addiction to ever more goods, to make room for public dialogue, which will lead us to how to limit intrusion on our privacy.
Thank you. And with that, what I'd like, anybody that has a question, comment, idea, please line up at the microphone.
Good afternoon. My question's for Mr. Rotenberg. You talk about how companies should provide the option or the knowledge of what they're doing with your data. What about I guess I would say their devil's advocate argument that when you click the terms of service that most people don't read at all, that's 55 pages of 2-point font, you're kind of agreeing to that, and when given the option anyway, we pick the free thing that costs, the thing that costs nothing, but we give a little privacy. Like I use Google Docs instead of Word, I use Google Maps instead of paying for a map function, and all of these free things that make my life infinitely easier. The price that I am paying is a little bit of, Google knows how I live my life in every way.
Yeah. Well, it's an excellent question. I mean, first of all, you point to the fact that most privacy policies on websites, those terms and conditions don't actually provide privacy protection. It's a form of a waiver, disclaimer. The company is saying to you, if you visit our website or do business with us, this is what we'll do with your personal data. And so by visiting the site or clicking on the policy, you've accepted those terms and have lost any claims you might otherwise make. So I already see that problem as something that needs to change. I don't think companies should routinely disclaim their responsibility to protect your privacy. Someone said earlier, I think it was you, Bruce, you know, that healthcare companies and banks and others have been subject to, you know, big hacks over the last several years. Well, it's actually their customers and clients who have been subject to those computer crimes, because it's their data, their credit card information, their social security numbers that become available to criminals, and that's your information that the companies obtain from you and then try to disclaim. Now that goes into part two, which is what is the real cost to you? And I would say it's actually very difficult for you to assess. One of the things about the internet-based economy is you have none of the price mechanisms we understand so well. I mean, if you walk into a store and you see a jacket that you like, and you know, one is $70 and one is $130, you pause for a moment, try to figure out, you know, is it worth paying the extra $60? And we're all, I would say, pretty smart consumers. Not because we're trying to buy a lot of stuff, it's because we have limited resources and we're trying to figure out how to use those resources. We understand price, but we don't understand at all what happens in the online economy when we make those decisions. And companies are giving you free stuff, by the way, because they're trying to drive out their competitors who may actually have a better product or service to offer you if they can survive. But if they're forced out by a big company that for a period of time is able to give you stuff for free and keep you with them, that competition, that innovation never occurs. So I think we need to begin to think about these issues from a much bigger sort of social, political perspective. Many people have the experience you do, and they wonder, what's the real consequence? And as I said, our book, you know, tries to promote that discussion.
Just to add one more thing to that, we are so used to think about the government and the private sector. For some people, the government is evil and the private sector is wonderful. Some people think the government needs to regulate the private sector more, but they both sides agree, liberal and conservatives. They are two very different worlds. Well, if you look at what those companies do who collect or suck in all this information, at night they sell it to the government. So if the FBI would cap...
Are you agreeing with me? I can't tell.
I'm shocked. But that is not fair. If you have been doing this too often, you know better.
We've agreed before.
No. What I'm saying is it's a very serious situation here, because if the FBI would keep a dossier on 200 million innocent Americans, I think most people would go berserk. When it's kept by two corporations in Arkansas, and they sell it at night to the FBI, nobody says a word. The difference now between a private sector data bank and an FBI is one click and one check. So we need a whole new way to think about it, which does not say the First Amendment applies to the public sector, but the private sector can do what they want. That requires a major, major normative and legal change, which we haven't even begun to engage in.
Next question.
Yes, just a comment first is that most of the collection of data by companies is for economic gain, and it would be great if it was, the default was opt-out rather than opt-in. Unfortunately, it's the other way around.
Do you mean the other way?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, opt-in
Yes.
rather than opt-out. The question I have really is, the Patriot Act is being reviewed now by Congress, and there may be some changes to it, maybe not. Could you talk about the political climate that you see of where that's going to go in the next month or so?
I'll try to give a brief answer. I mean,
we have 5 minutes. So.
Yeah. So the current provisions, the key provisions, expire June 1st, and Congress is trying to get something done before that debate. Senator Leahy, Congressman Sensenbrenner, I think have a very good proposal. In answer to Amitai's point, one of the goals that we've pursued at EPIC is to avoid zero-sum outcomes. I mean, law enforcement has real concerns, as do the privacy advocates. And the question is, how do you get a good result in the context of the legislative process? Our view is that one of the best ways to get a good result is more transparency, more accountability, which basically says, yes, government needs those tools to protect the public, but they need to be accountable about how they use them. So to the extent that we can get support for more accountable use of the tools, I think we'll end up with a better bill. And I think there is support for it, but of course, you know, who knows what will happen.
And I think this might be the last question here.
to start off with, I'm a technologist. So I'd like to put a few things on the floor and get your thoughts on it. One is, I think in today's domain, privacy, as we think about it, is a fool's paradise. Because if we are sitting at our machine, if we're typing away, as Jim Dwyer pointed out, you can be entering content. If you choose not to enter it, you just type it out. It's accessed anyway. So the point is not necessarily what does the intended end user do with it, it's who else has access to it en route. And as such, if I'm creating things at home on my machine, the very first thing I do is shut off the RF so that my machine is not talking to the web, all right? I'm talking to my machine, but I'm not broadcasting it. So I don't have to worry about somebody else picking up my thoughts. To take that to another extreme, we all know that there is voice recognition software. And consequently, if I'm sitting in my room having a detailed conversation with someone, and I say, I don't have to worry about that, I'm not on the machine now. Well, effectively, if there's voice recognition content there, it can easily take that conversation and transmit it onto the web.
Right, so let me just very quickly answer you. I mean, first of all, even your safeguards won't work unless your home is tempest tested. You can still get the information off the keyboard. But the reason for this book is actually a response to the dictum of a very famous technologist, Thomas Edison, who simply said, what man creates with his hand, he should control with his head. And we need to think about the use of these technologies over the long term, not just as consumers, but as citizens, as people participating in a democratic government. I think we do have the ability to control the use of these technologies, and one of the tests of our ability will be whether we can safeguard privacy.
I agree with that. Effectively, I think we're in a fool's paradise if we don't acknowledge the fact that everything that our machine has access to, we have just, if you will, to a degree, compromised. And I think that's a two-way stream. Mark,
we're like you know, in Tom Sawyer, everybody sees him painting the fence, and they would give him a nickel or a penny so they can pay. They want to pay him to paint his work, do his work for him, and that's what we're doing with our content on the internet. We're painting Zuckerberg and Google's fences for them with our stuff, and so like the young technologists I wrote about in here are trying to build, and there's a lot of these young folks around who are trying to build better mousetraps that don't catch our tails all the time. And I'm very optimistic that that's going to happen. Maybe in 10, 20 years, we're going to have a much more productive relationship, thanks to people like these kids.
I'm just going to add one sentence to that.
I'll tell you, I'm sorry, but we do have to end, especially on that. I appreciate everybody coming. I do want to direct you right out that door so you could purchase these gentlemen's books and get their signature. So please head out there, right to the activity building. Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
We have one more panel remaining, live from the Annapolis Book Festival in Maryland. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel John Noggle and journalist James Risen will discuss the war on terror in just a few moments. We'll be right back. C-SPAN 2 providing live coverage of the U.S. Senate floor proceedings and key public